an original.
From Story Studio Network.
The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next? The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. Now, among the values expressed by Daily Bread Food Bank is the commitment to create, support evidence-based solutions. So to that end, new research from the University of Calgary draws a solid, direct line between food bank visits and specific government policy. Now, the report found that the number of food bank visits directly rises with increases in rent. They fall with increases in minimum wage or disability benefits available to individuals requiring social assistance. Sounds obvious, but it's the first time we have this evidence-based research to put in front of government. The study was penned by Margarita Wilkins and Ron Kneebone, and Professor Kneebone is here to walk us through the research. How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
It's interesting as I've been following this story and certainly developing some of the discussion around it for the purposes of this podcast. It occurs to me that when people who are living in poverty, and particularly those who are relying on government benefits or some kind of a disability pension, those of us who do not live in that world don't really, I don't think, have a full understanding or an awareness of how deeply the problem is right across the country and how difficult it is for folks who are in that circumstance to get out of it.
You're right. It's a really difficult problem, especially if you're not one who has experienced it yourself. Someone like me, all I can do is gather data and look at the data and try to interpret what that information is telling us. And that's what I did. Rita Wilkins and I did for our report for Daily Bread. Just to give you a sense, there have been surveys done of people who use food banks and asking them about their budgets. For someone who has used a food bank, their budget typically involves spending about 60 to 70% of their limited income on maintaining shelter. So that's paying rent and paying utilities. Another 20-25% goes to paying for food. So if you add those up, you're pretty much exhausted your income. We haven't accounted for clothing, unexpected dental bill, for example, or unexpected utility bill. All of a sudden, the heat bill was higher than you expected. And if you're in that situation, there's not a lot you can do. You can turn down the heat. You can maybe skip a meal. But you can't save money on your housing, on your shelter. It's an all or nothing kind of proposition. So you're really stuck. And a food bank is kind of a relief valve. I can't do anything about my rent that's eating up a biggest portion of my budget. But I can go to a food bank if I need to in order to take some pressure off my food bill, at least temporarily or maybe permanently, depending on your circumstances. So that's the situation that someone's in that uses a food bank. They're in dire straits and they're really in a tough position. And if that unexpected utility bill, or maybe just an unexpected loss of a few hours of income, if that lasts for any length of time, then you're going to have to make a commitment. Maybe it's going to have to be a long-term commitment to using a food bank. For most people, it's not. It's relatively short-term, but it depends on your circumstances. For someone relying on disability benefits from government, you're typically in an even tougher spot, because if you've been able to secure disability benefits, it means that you've convinced the government that you're not able to work, or not for very, very much. You have limited capacity to work. So you have even fewer options. And so you're really reliant on the size of that disability benefit you get from government to maintain your shelter and avoid homelessness, and maintain a food budget in order to avoid going hungry. Mm-hmm. So again, you're really in dire straits here, and you're really up against it.
So there's a couple of things that I want to kind of pick away at there. First is the idea that we've all become used to using the phrase a lagging indicator as we've gone through COVID, and we've seen that, hospital stays are the lagging indicator of how bad the situation really is. When you look at it in that context, the food bank numbers are fairly immediate. That indicates where the current crisis is right now, and it's only going to get worse if we don't do something about it.
Yeah. And again, as an economist, I love data. And one of the things that you really want if you're working in the social policy area is you want data that is immediate, that will tell you that there's a problem developing. Food bank data is not put out by government. It's put out by organizations like Daily Bread. And I would encourage them to make that more publicly available than it is now, because when the numbers of people going to the food bank, a food bank, increase, and they have been very rapidly, in the paper, Rita and I talked about, it's like the canary in a coal mine. When that canary dies, you've got trouble. And when food bank visits start to go up, this is an indication that the social assistance programs are not working for people. They're not generous enough, or it may also be that housing costs are going up so quickly and food costs are going up so quickly that the income they are being provided with is not sufficient. So food bank visits, which have been going up like a rocket for the last little while and continue to do so now, are telling us something. And what they're telling us is that the income support programs that are in place are woefully inadequate.
So is it safe, or is it useful or even accurate to suggest that number, that growing number, becomes a legitimate economic indicator?
I would use it as such. I would, if I were running the government in Ontario, no one would ever want that. But if I were, I'd be asking food banks to make that data available to me, to my ministry, and I would encourage the ministry to start paying attention to those numbers and say, whoa, what is happening? Because it's when food bank visits go up, it's because people are being forced to do something they don't want to. No one wants to be doing this, but they've been forced by their circumstances to use a food bank. The next thing after relying on a food bank, and not all people using food banks are on social assistance. Mm-hmm. Some are working poor and they're just trying to get by. As people start going to food banks, you can bet that social assistance caseloads will start going up as well. You can also bet that homelessness will start to go up as people are deciding that I cannot continue to pay both for food and housing. And so they give up housing. That's their next step. And they experience homelessness. They might be sleeping on a family member or friend's couch. They might be rough sleeping, but that's their only alternative if they can't continue to pay rent. So I would encourage, government should be looking at these data and following them very closely, because they are, as you say, a leading indicator that a lot of trouble is coming down on you.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, and you point out already that you don't necessarily have to be collecting a benefit or a welfare check or whatever it might be from the government to be in the case where you're using the food bank. Now, I know specifically you were looking at this in the context of Toronto. Do you get a, maybe I can't, it's unfair to ask this question, but do you get a sense that this trend happens right across the country?
Certainly, that's my sense, and it has to be, basically. We're all reading about how the crisis, people have talked about crisis in the housing sector because housing prices go up. Of course, for someone like you and me, that's not a real crisis. A crisis is when you're at risk of losing your home. So it's people with very low incomes who are at risk. And they're seeing very rapid increases in rents, and that's putting them at risk of homelessness and at risk of having to rely more heavily on food banks. We're also reading about higher food prices as well. And again, I can maybe absorb that. Part of the reason I can absorb it is because I've got some savings. But if you're on the cusp of homelessness, or if you're on the cusp of deep poverty, you don't have savings. And so when higher food prices go up, what your only relief valve is to rely on a food bank. So I am willing to go on the limb and say over the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to see rapid increases in poverty rates, and you're going to see rapid increases in rates of homelessness and food bank use, unless governments step up and start to provide greater levels of income support to people in need.
Mm-hmm. I'd be curious to know, because as you were doing your work, if you saw any relationship where CERB, for example, when it was introduced, it allowed people some flexibility, some comfort at least. Did you see where perhaps in some cases the food bank use went down as a result of that?
Well, we actually stopped our analysis short of COVID because we didn't want COVID to interfere with what we're doing. So, which makes our message even stronger, actually, because...
So to be clear, your numbers are all pre-COVID.
They're all pre-COVID.
Holy cow. Okay, yeah, I didn't realize that.
So things have gotten worse than what Rita and I describe in our paper. But what we show is that if you do increase levels of benefits to people, whether it's social assistance or through CERB, the answer is the same. If you provide people with additional income, then it will reduce their having to rely on food banks. So CERB may have alleviated some of the pressure on food banks, but on the other hand, CERB was there for a reason. It was there because people were losing their employment. And so there's replacing one with another. So it's really hard to say unless one gets that data and looks at it closely.
So let's look at the sort of that cause and effect. And I'm curious, first of all, to just start with that whole argument around minimum wage. And here in Ontario, we talk about it being $14 or $15 and what's a livable wage. And we talk to the Regional Board of Trade and they'll say, well, it's probably somewhere in the low to mid 20s. But you contextualize that $1 increase makes a significant effect, not necessarily to how I live my life, but to how the use or how much I would rely perhaps on a food bank.
Yeah. So again, giving people more income is going to take the pressure off your budget. Again, you're on the cusp of using a food bank. You're spending 60-70% on just housing and utility. You're spending another 20-25% on food. You've got nothing left. If I can give you an extra $1 an hour on your minimum wage, which is a significant increase, then it's going to take the pressure off you, and you may not have to rely on a food bank as much as you did before. But keep in mind that an increase in minimum wage helps some people, it doesn't help all. So a $1 increase in minimum wage, you might think, well, that's another $35, $40 a week. But that's only if you're working full time. Right. If you're not working full time, and a lot of people don't, they have trouble keeping those hours, then it's not helping you nearly as much as you might think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, but even when you looked at it, I think the numbers that they were suggesting, they translated that to the number of food bank visits in Toronto alone, and it's almost 37,000 visits.
Oh, yeah. It certainly makes a difference. And again, it speaks to the number of people on the cusp. And we need to remember that the number of people at risk of using a homeless shelter or using a food bank is a big number. It's even bigger than the number of people visiting a food bank. The fact that many people the additional number of people going to a food bank is so large tells you that there's actually a very large population out there who are on the cusp. And they're ready to use the food bank the next unfortunate event that comes along. So these are serious issues for a lot of people.
And one of the things you talked about, sort of these unexpected issues. Well, the war in Ukraine was unexpected and quite directly has an effect on that because it's driven up the cost of just about everything from fuel to housing to the food you're putting on your table. So all of those are historic increases. It sounds to me like you're going to be busy trying to update the material in this report.
It's an really important issue for and you're absolutely right. I wish when I read the debates about these sorts of issues in the newspaper, on social media, the focus is typically about middle-class Canadians, how it's impacting them. And I want people to change direction a little bit and think less of themselves and think more about people that we're trying to describe in our report. People who are dedicating 60 to 70% of their income on rent. And this is not necessarily a nice place to live in. And another 20, 25% on food. For them, an additional increase in the price of food is just a disaster. For me, it's not. It's maybe, and for most Canadians, it's not. Especially since we have savings that we can lean back on. Say, okay, well, let's run up the credit card. Let's just borrow some money. People we're talking about are not in that position. And so I just want people to understand that when we talk about the rising cost of housing, for you and me, it might be an inconvenience. It might be a big inconvenience, but it typically means that, well, I'm just not able to buy that house I was hoping to be able to buy. But you're still in the rental unit that you're in. You're still housed. For a large fraction of the population, they're at risk of losing that. So that's a crisis. Losing your shelter is a crisis. Now you can watch your health deteriorate. Your prospects for your kids, and there's a lot of family shelters out there with kids in them. They have no prospects whatsoever. They're having trouble staying in school. Everybody's health is deteriorating like crazy. They are in serious, serious troubles. And as we talked earlier, the number of people having to rely on food banks is a really good indication of what's to come. And we really got to start paying attention to this.
Well, you're kind of drawing a whole circle around that cost of poverty. And I cite the pre-COVID number that they came up with here in Ontario, and it was $33 billion a year. And, then it begs the question, then how can we afford not to address this issue when you start to put it in those terms? I can't imagine what the number is nationally.
Sure. And I think the way to understand this, does it cost more to provide increased disability benefits to people? Yes, it does. It's expensive. But understand it's an investment. It's an investment that pays a rate of return. And the rate of return comes in the form of less use of emergency departments because your health is better. You're able to maintain your housing. It's cost savings in terms of keeping people out of shelters. It's cost savings in the form of investing in kids' future, the children of people in these circumstances. These are wonderful investments with high rates of return. And so I think when you think of that as an investment, it's easier for people to accept, yes, this makes sense because it has a high rate of return. There's also a rate of return, a negative rate of return for not doing it. Mm-hmm. Because if you're not doing it, people are filling up homeless shelters, which are expensive places. They are filling up emergency departments because of the ill health effects of having to sleep outside or not being able to separate during a period of COVID. We had another paper that we looked at. When COVID came along, it's easy for you and I to self-isolate, follow the instructions of public health officials. But if you're sharing a rent with other people, sharing with another family, or sleeping on a friend's couch, you're subject to spreading that virus much more than others. So all of this should be understood to be a very worthwhile investment in people.
So let's finish this on what appears to be a relatively positive note. And as you and I are having this discussion, the major parties in Ontario are all releasing their platforms for the election that will be held in June of 2022. They have each committed to increasing the ODSP, the Ontario Disability Support Program, if elected. And the Tory government of the day has said, well, if we're elected, we'll do the same. But when I went back and I looked at your numbers, and, you know, it just became a such an important number in terms of being able to lift people up out of poverty. Again, we see this extraordinary reduction in the number of food bank visits. But one of the problems that I realize we run into with ODSP, particularly here in Ontario, and I suspect there are other programs like that across the country, is that if you do go to get a job, there's a clawback provision in there. And so it makes it very difficult to kind of get over that hump. These kinds of increases, it sounds to me, uneducated ear of mine, that we would be, well, we're on the right path here. Somebody has stepped up and taken notice of this to realize, to your point earlier, this is an economic indicator and it's worth the investment. Yeah,
and I'm so pleased to hear it's an all-party response that we need, that in Ontario disability benefits need to be increased. When you think about those numbers, the size of those increases, they sound impressive, and they are. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact it's catching up. So for many years now, the real value, the inflation-adjusted value of disability benefits have been falling in Ontario. And that we have identified that as one of the reasons why food bank visits are going up. So what I would, as pleased as I am to hear that all parties are talking about increasing the size of the disability benefit, I would also like to hear them commit to indexing it to inflation so that this does not happen in the future. So that as prices rise, the disability benefit will rise with it. And this will prevent what we saw over the last 5 or 10 years, which is the real value of the benefits falling over time, forcing people into using food banks. So now that we've got the ear of politicians on disability benefits, I think we should continue to shout at them. That's great, but now let's also index it for inflation.
Yeah, well, that would put a significant dent, though, just given the numbers. If you're talking about, I think in there, the report cited a $15 a month increase in ODSP. The minimum would be like $50 up to $230. So yep. It would have a significant effect. When we looked at the number here, it suggests that doing so would reduce Ontario's food bank visits by more than 250,000 visits a year. Yep. There's a huge red flag right there. Yeah. That will have a significant effect one way or the other.
Yeah, and to put it differently, that's 250,000 visits. To put that differently, those are all cases of people saying, phew, our budget has been relaxed sufficiently that I do not need to go to a food bank and ask for free food. I can stand on my feet. I can be more self-reliant. And that's a huge rate of return.
And to be clear, I mean, people will fuss around that number. The visits do not indicate individuals, but it does, in many cases, represent families.
Oh, absolutely. And so all we had information on was the number of visits. So we don't know the number of individuals. It could be the same family going over and over again. Mm-hmm. We have, however, we have evidence from other food banks. So there was a study done a few years ago out of Vancouver that emphasized that most people visiting food banks do so relatively infrequently. So it's more of a stopgap measure. And relatively few rely on it long term. And that's important because it tells you that if you could increase the size of the income these people are dealing with, then you could have significant impacts on food bank visits. And that's, of course, what we're seeing. So again, it doesn't take huge amounts of money. It just has to be enough to provide people with the security that they're seeking. And remember, these benefits are not designed to lift you out of poverty. So even amounts that you've been talking about being promised by all parties, that's not going to lift people out of poverty. But what it will do is it will provide them with the income security that they need to establish an appropriate level of housing given their income and be able to maintain a budget that they can continue to house themselves and feed themselves.
Ron Kneebone is a professor at the University of Calgary. He co-authored The Sensitivity of Food Bank Visits to Social Assistance, Housing, and Labor Market Conditions in Toronto. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast produced by Eye Contact Productions.